As requested, I'm going to give you a little tour of my home automation system today. I'll be covering anything from lighting to security to climate control, and hope you enjoy. So I figured I would start with talking about my do-it-yourself HVAC climate control system I use in my upstairs bedrooms. So both these bedrooms up here have electric baseboard heaters, which you can see down there behind me. And they've got Windows air conditioners, which you can see right there. They're both pretty cheap hair models, which seem to be okay. They're really noisy. I don't really recommend them if you want a quiet AC, but they were really easy to mod, so that part I appreciate. And we also have a wall-mounted sensor here which does the humidity and temperature in this room. And that's based off of a WiMOS D1 Mini, and I believe that's an SHT30 sensor in there. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. I'll link to another video I made that kind of covers this system. I do warn you, it's pretty bad video because I kind of did it in one take, and I said a lot because I didn't really know what I was going to say, but I did cover it in detail, so watch it at your own risk, but you've been warned. So having said that, I'm going to move on. I'll link that in the comments. Man, it's really raining out there. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's coming down. So although I really like open source automation, I do have a Honeywell system for my furnace, which is, in my opinion, a temporary solution. It is integrated into Home Assistant. I do have a separate RedLink bridge that's in my basement, and it does work okay, but I don't think it's very accurate in comparison to my upstairs systems. The other issue I have is there's a ton of errors with the integration in Home Assistant. WebSocket errors because it basically logs into the web interface to control it. So I'm not a big fan. It does work, but it is what it is for now. All right, and the last part of my climate control system is my basement humidity. So this is very simple. It uses basically just a smart plug. It's very, very, very simple. That is like a 17 amp rated smart plug, and it just switches on and off a pretty generic dehumidifier, which is set to max. One neat thing is that smart plug has power monitoring. So what I'm able to do is I'm able to check what the current draw on the plug is when it's on, and if the current draw is basically nothing, then I'll know that the dehumidifier isn't running, which means the bucket's full. So I can set up a Home Assistant notification that lets me know when the bucket is full based on that sensor data, which is kind of handy. And again, it required no modifications of the unit. So all the climate control systems, my upstairs and the basement, that's all ran through Node-RED. I didn't cover the dehumidifier in much detail in actually I don't even think I talked about it at all in my other video, but it runs on the same principles as my upstairs bedrooms, except for instead of controlling temperature, it's controlling humidity. I will post all the Node-RED flows for you guys to look at. I do apologize in advance that my documentation is not the best, but hopefully there's enough information there to, get started if you want to do something similar. So the last thing I'm going to mention about my climate control system is I've got, aside from my random WiMOS D1 Mini based sensors around the house, I've also got a few DHT22 sensors, such as this one right here, which you may have seen in another video. And these are wired into a box right here, running a Arduino, which is powered by a PoE via the PoE splitter. And at the moment, you can see a bunch of cables coming out of there because I had big plans for this, but I'm only running this sensor here, and I've got another cable running outside, which runs my outdoor temperature sensor, which is also a DHT22. Can't really tell, but my outdoor sensor is kind of up there. It's at the end of that spool or that roll of white cable because it was done as a temporary measure, and I was gonna, make it look nicer, but I haven't got around to it. The weather is wild today. Upstairs it was just torrentially raining, and now I look out my basement window, which is soaked, and it looks like the sun's out. All right, I'm gonna talk about my security setup now. I'll talk about my alarm system and my security cameras. We're gonna start with the alarm system. So behind here in the shadows, you're going to see a DSC Power 832 enclosure, and that's exactly what's in it. It is a Power 832 series alarm system. This system is actually fantastic. It's hardwired, it's reliable, it has a battery backup on its own. I also plan to run it off my main server backup if there's a power failure at some point in the future. The reason I like this system so much is that because there's a module made by a company called Eyes On, this allows me to basically make this old system into a smart system. Although they do have their own monitoring setup, which I do use as kind of a backup, I do also have an integration into Home Assistant, which gives me all my alarm data in Home Assistant and allows me to create automations based on sensors, based on triggers, you name it. So it's a great system. So I've got 3 hardwired smoke alarms, 1 on each floor. These are a Kitty CO2 fire combo. What I did is they actually sell a module that you can wire in, and that allows you to basically trigger an external device if smoke is detected. They also make one for CO2, but I'm only running the smoke one at this point. So in this junction box in my basement, I've got the module installed, and basically that's hooked up to my alarm fire zone on the DSC system. So if the smoke alarms go off, it immediately triggers the fire zone. This is pretty sweet because I'm able to use just off-the-shelf smoke alarms and integrate them into my alarm system. And in 10 years, when these ones need to be replaced, I can just replace them with the same brand, and that module should still work. Now, the only downside is I don't get a per floor report. So if smoke is detected, it's just going to say smoke is detected, and I won't know what floor. So I'm just going to talk about something slightly different before I continue with the alarm. I actually have a Sonoff RF bridge, I believe it's called, running Tasmota, and that's set up in my living room. And that just kind of sits here and minds its own business. It's plugged in, it's powered off my power conditioner. And yes, you'll see I do have a great supply of vintage playback equipment, such as cassette player, VHS. I got my Super Nintendo because you can't have a living room set up without a Super Nintendo. And what that allows me to do is integrate RF 433 megahertz sensors into my Home Assistant. Because the Invisalink module allows me to actually trigger my home alarm, I'm able to trigger it from Home Assistant. So by using the RF bridge, I'm able to add additional sensors that are easily purchased on AliExpress for dollars. So because of that ability to add extra sensors, I've added some leak sensors and shock sensors on my basement windows. So by default, this house was configured with all the windows and doors on the main floor wired up to the alarm, which is great. But down here in my basement, I currently don't have these windows wired up. This one we recently replaced, so this will have a hardwired sensor in the future, but I decided to put that shock sensor up there for now until I do that. And then my other window does not actually have the ability to open it, so I just have a shock sensor mounted there. So what happens is if my home alarm is armed and these sensors get triggered, Home Assistant will trigger the home alarm, and all the sirens will go off, and my automations will also go off, which include turning on every single light that's controllable in the house. So I also have these leak sensors. I've got 3 of them, one under my fridge, one under my washing machine, and one under my hot water tank, as you can see here. The other ones are kind of hard to get to, so I'm not going to show them. But basically, this is a very, very simple design. It's just got 2 metal probes here, which are clearly bolts sticking out the bottom. And it just monitors the resistance. So right now, the circuit would be completely open. But if water comes into contact with these, what'll happen is the circuit will start to close and show a certain amount of resistance. And then when it detects that amount of resistance in between the probes, it will send out a RF signal, and again, that will trigger a notification. That in particular is not set up with the home alarm because I don't need the siren going off if there's water detected, but that triggers a notification to both of our cell phones, and we'll be told which device is leaking, and then we can address it right away. A future plan for that is installing a smart water valve for the house water shutoff, so that if a leak is detected and we're not home, Home Assistant will automatically close the valve and limit the amount of flooding. Unfortunately, this being an old house, I don't have any drains in my basement, At the moment, my hot water tank is not in a tray, which is something I'm going to address at some point. But right now, as you can see, if my tank were to spring a leak, it's just going to basically get everywhere. So this has two purposes, and we're going to be talking about the security right now, and then afterwards you'll see when I talk about all my lighting, I'll cover the lighting aspect. So this is kind of an interesting contraption I put together here. You can see that it's got a pretty heavy 12-volt line coming in, which is going into a fuse block so that everything that I'm running is fused. And I've got all my outputs up there, and you'll notice that the bottom row of relays actually have nothing plugged into them because that was just for future expandability. Right now I've got this, which is kind of nasty looking, but it does the trick. And this is all ran off a Arduino Mega with an Ethernet shield. And this is a no-name brand or off-brand shield, which has given me a lot of grief. I don't recommend buying these. I would just go with something from a genuine company. So security is quite simple. I've just got this little block on the side which has two motion sensors and this contact sensor on the door here hooked up, and quite simply it just sends MQTT status messages to Home Assistant when the door is open or closed or motion is triggered or, you know, clear. It's pretty straightforward. So up here is the motion sensor for my yard, and then in here is my carport motion sensor. And these are mainly used just to send notifications if something's detected. I actually have the yard one turned off because I have a lot of false positives. But they also are used to trigger the lighting. And you can see in here, it's one of those switches that I'll be talking about in a bit. Also, fun fact, I don't know why this was built like this, but there's literally trees growing through the roof of my carport. Behind me, I've got the family boat. My grandpa bought this new in 1965. I don't know if it works, but it was passed on to me. I'll be testing it soon, and I'm wondering if I should turn it into a smart boat. I don't really know what that means yet, but I'm thinking there might be a way. Okay, so power monitoring. I don't really have any triggers or automations based off of power monitoring aside from sending myself a daily report that tells me if I've used more or less than my goal. And you'll notice these numbers are actually quite high, but unfortunately running a dehumidifier takes a lot of power and I don't have much of a choice in this basement. I'll link my video about how this system works, but it's also got an Arduino installed in here, and I'm just using a couple CT clamps on the main lines coming in from the pole. And, oh, I guess I only mounted it with one screw. Classic. Anyways, I'm using a Cat 5 cable to go into the box, and then this is also ran on PoE, but the PoE module, in this case, PoE splitter module, is actually installed inside here in a very sloppy manner. So it's a very simple system, but it gives me some pretty cool ways of reporting power usage. I've got a Grafana graph set up, as you can see here, which kind of plots the power usage with the temperature outside. Over the winter months, this really shows when I was using my electric heaters upstairs. And I also have some basic information showing in Home Assistant, like what the power consumption is on each leg and then a total combined watts. At the moment, my wattage isn't 100% accurate because I'm just using 120 volt as a fixed number. But in the future, I'm going to basically get some sort of system to monitor the voltage so I can do that math equation a lot more accurately because it'll be dynamic as the voltage fluctuates quite a bit. All right, so I'm in my laundry room here, and I'm just going to show you a little bit about my lighting setup. So I've got a bunch of these cheap Amazon switches. They're all Wi-Fi. I don't remember exactly what the brand is, but they are certified, so I'm not too worried about any issues like with fires and all that. One of the things I do is I make sure that I'm not loading any of these switches or plugs over 50% of what they're rated for. And that kind of is an extra safety measure I take to make sure I don't run into any issues. These switches have been great. I've got a whole whack of them. In this room alone, I've got this one and I've got this one here. All these switches are running ESPHome, which allows me to do a couple cool things. So one of the things I do is I have an override, because as you can probably imagine, all my lights are automated. But if I've got guests over or something like that and I don't want them to shut off at the normal time, I've got something called an override outdoor lights. So I can just hold down this button for about 2 seconds, and what it'll do is it'll turn on my override automation, or sorry, my override switch in Home Assistant, which will stop those automations from triggering. After a certain amount of time, I think it's 8 hours, it will automatically reset to standard mode. Another thing I can do is if I double tap, it turns on all the switches. I know it's kind of hard to tell in the video, but that's just an automation again based on Home Assistant and ESPHome. So the nice thing with ESPHome is you can actually set up the different functions of the button, I guess you could say, right in the configuration, as you can see on the screen here. So I've got the double tap and I've got the tap and hold basically showing up in Home Assistant as different triggers. So this functionality is pretty great because by default they want you to use the EWE-Link app, which again kind of puts everything on the internet into a cloud that's hosted probably overseas, and I don't really trust that. So by running ESPHome on all these switches, and actually all my smart plugs as well, I'm able to have full control over these switches, and I'm not worried about them contacting anyone on the internet. So out here I do have my front arch smart bulb, which is a Tekken bulb from Amazon, and I've modified that, and it's also, that one's actually running Tasmota, which again is an open source firmware, and that's linked in with Home Assistant. And while I'm out here, I'll also mention I do have my little fountain here automated. I've got a Sonoff basic relay, which is installed in that little waterproof electrical box down there. So the reason I use a smart bulb out here is, for some reason, this wasn't wired as a switched light. It's just as on 24/7. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Originally, there was a day-night sensor here, which has died, and that was bypassed. So this fixture is just on 24/7. So by having that smart bulb in there, I'm able to control it. I also can change the color and brightness with that, which is also kind of neat. So I've got a couple of these Jinyu power bars. And these are 4 individually controllable outlets and a couple of USBs, which you can actually turn off the USBs as well, which is kind of neat. And this is a Wi-Fi power bar. This one does have certification for use in North America, the safety certification, which is great. And these are pretty cheap on Amazon. They're about like $26 Canadian, so even cheaper in US dollars. And these were pretty easy to flash over to Tasmota, running the over-the-air flash method, which I'll post a link in the video description on how to do. And these are basically how I control all my lamps in the living room. So they're all plugged into here, some with extension cords, some directly in, and that kind of takes care of that. In addition to that, I've got this little cheap remote, and this is connected to my RF bridge, which I talked about earlier. And basically I've assigned these buttons to do different things. So as an example, I believe number 3 should be this lamp here. A little bit of a delay, but not too bad. And I've got other things like 8 turns off and on all my outdoor lights, 7, I think was the Christmas tree for when that's hooked up. Again, just using a smart plug, and so on and so forth. They just do different things that are handy. So this lamp here, just an ordinary lamp plugged into another smart plug running open source firmware. This one I believe is Tasmota. Not really much to say about this lamp except for I've got a very cool automation set up so that when we turn off our living room TV, which usually means we're going to come up to go to bed, it turns on and then we don't trip going up the stairs. That's based off of the Yamaha integration in Home Assistant, which allows me to get the status of my receiver in the living room into Home Assistant. So in my bedroom, I've got another smart plug. This has got a dual plug on it, and this is just for our 2 lamps. Another thing I've done is I got these cheap switches off of AliExpress, which basically turn off and on these lamps. And this one will do the lamp on the other side. Pretty straightforward. This remote is for my heating in this room. So you can see there's a few different commonly used temperatures there, and it's auto, heat, cool, or off. So I just kind of stuck this in here so that we had a quick and easy way to change the temperature since there's no physical controls on the wall. All right, lighting. So this relay board turns off and on my 12 volt lighting outside. I've just got a bunch of pretty cheap 10 watt fixtures located around this carport, some in the alley, some on the road outside, which you'll see pictured there, and then the ones in my yard. And these are just used for, you know, quite simply security lighting, or if I'm working or need light outside for something. And if the alarm's armed, they will automatically turn on if there's motion. They'll also turn on if we're not home. This way, if we're enjoying the backyard and like at night or something, and we move, we're not gonna have the motion lights come on, which is kind of annoying to me, especially for like sitting by the fire. But then when we're sleeping and the alarm's armed, or again, if we're not home, they will turn on if there's motion. All right, let's talk about irrigation quickly. This is a pretty nasty little setup I whipped up. It's two 120 volt solenoid valves that I got from Amazon, and I'm just using like plumber's tape, and they're just mounted to the board pretty securely. And I've got a sawn-off dual in there, which turns them on and off. And I had a Node Red flow that kind of controlled these based on weather and scheduling, but it's completely broken now, so I'm gonna have to reinvent it this year if I plan to use it again. Mainly I had this going because last year I planted new grass, and I wanted to make sure that they were watered on a regular schedule, but also respected our watering restrictions for summer. This is my radio-based reporting system that I can basically get a update if I'm out of cellular range. I will make another follow-up video as promised about how this works in more detail, but for now there is a link of me testing out the system with a basic introduction of what it is. But it operates at 144.390 megahertz, and it uses a protocol called APRS. This is all ham radio stuff, so you probably have never heard of it unless you know someone or you are a ham yourself. But it's pretty interesting stuff that you can integrate this right into Home Assistant, and there's still definitely real-world applications. And lastly, my security cameras. I post a link to another video I made about how I secured these cameras, basically using VLANs. So I'm not going to talk about too much about these, but these are just your generic cheap PoE cameras that came from AliExpress, and a cheap DVR. All of this whole network is offline, so the only way I can access this DVR directly is if I VPN in. This keeps my network protected from any potential security flaws that these cameras most likely have. My production assistant is here, making sure I'm doing a good job. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions, which I'm sure many will, definitely post them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer. And maybe I can make another video about certain specific things that people want to know more about in the future. Again, thanks for watching, and if you want to see more, please like and subscribe.